At exactly 11:47 a.m. on March 7, 2026, the iron gates of Buckingham Palace swung open with a metallic screech that pierced the London morning air. Princess Catherine stepped into the frame of the live television feed. But something was wrong. The press room behind her stood empty. The gilded chairs sat vacant. She wasn't broadcasting from inside the palace walls. She stood on gravel, wind pulling at her dark hair, with rolling countryside stretched behind her. No crown, no royal backdrop, no protocol officer whispering instructions in her ear. Just Catherine, a microphone, and the weight of a decision that would crack the monarchy's foundation. "I have something to tell you about my son Louis," she began, her voice steady as stone. "And I will not be silenced anymore." The camera caught her hands trembling, not from fear, but from pure rage barely held in check. Behind her, the shadow of a small cottage appeared in the frame. This wasn't Windsor. This wasn't Kensington. This was somewhere the crown couldn't reach. "For months, you've been told Louis is fine. You've been shown carefully staged photographs. You've been fed lies." She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "Today that ends." In the background, a figure moved across the cottage window. Small, child-sized, safe. Hi viewers, I want you to tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and following the rules that everyone expects you to follow? The feed continued, but royal correspondents across London were already reaching for their phones. The palace press office wasn't answering. The king's private secretary had gone silent. Catherine had just declared war on the very institution that made her a princess. The camera zoomed closer to her face, catching the moment her composure finally cracked. A single tear traced down her cheek, but her voice never wavered. "The diagnosis they've been hiding from you changes everything." Then the screen went black. What Catherine had just done wasn't simply a press conference gone rogue. This was a seismic shift in the DNA of constitutional monarchy itself. For 70 years, the unwritten rule had been carved in stone. Never complain, never explain. The crown protects itself by maintaining absolute control over information. Every photograph, every statement, every public appearance. Catherine had just burned that rulebook to ash. Royal historians would later call this moment the Great Fracture. The day a princess chose maternal instinct over institutional loyalty. The day the people's crown split from the sovereign's crown. Constitutional experts were already drafting emergency analyses. Because what Catherine represented wasn't rebellion. It was revolution. The stakes couldn't be higher. 1,000 years of precedent hung in the balance. The monarchy had survived civil wars, world wars, and constitutional crises. But it had never faced a mother who refused to sacrifice her child for the sake of royal appearances. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, polls were already shifting. The public wasn't asking what Catherine had done wrong. They were asking what the palace had been hiding. Support for the crown was bleeding away like water through a broken dam. The palace's emergency protocols had no playbook for this scenario. How do you silence someone who has already chosen to speak? How do you control someone who has already walked away from everything you could take from her? But hidden in the royal archives, buried deep in the constitutional documents from 1953, lay a dormant clause that King Charles was about to invoke. A clause that hadn't been used since the abdication crisis. A clause that would make Catherine's defiance a matter of national security. The first sign that something catastrophic had occurred came at 12:15 p.m., when every major news outlet in Britain received the same terse statement. Prince Louis is receiving medical care in a private facility. The family requests privacy during this time. But privacy was the last thing anyone was getting. Within hours, photographs began leaking online. Not official palace releases, raw, unfiltered images that told a story the crown had been desperate to hide. Louis, thinner than anyone had seen him in months. Louis, being carried when he should have been walking. Louis, with medical equipment partially visible in the background of what were supposed to be casual family photos. The public's reaction was immediate and devastating. Social media exploded with questions the palace couldn't answer without admitting they'd been lying for months. Hashtag Where is Louis began trending worldwide. Hashtag Save Louis followed within hours. Emergency meetings convened behind closed doors. Royal protection officers were quietly reassigned. The king's personal physician was summoned to Buckingham Palace with unusual urgency. Phone calls were made to newspaper editors, television executives, and social media platforms. The message was clear: contain this crisis at all costs. But containment was impossible when the crisis had already walked out the front door. By evening, investigative journalists had tracked Catherine's location. The cottage belonged to a private medical facility specializing in pediatric care. The kind of facility the royal family would never publicly acknowledge using. The kind of facility that suggested Louis's condition was far more serious than anyone had been told. A single photograph emerged on Twitter at 6:22 p.m. An unmarked black SUV in the driveway of the cottage, its trunk open. In the back, clearly visible, was a small suitcase with a hospital identification tag still attached to the handle. The document that changed everything sat locked in a filing cabinet marked Category Red in the basement of Clarence House. File designation: Directive 9. Classification level: Eyes only. Contents: a complete medical assessment of Prince Louis, dated 8 months earlier, with recommendations that would horrify any parent. The assessment was clinical, cold, and devastating. Louis's developmental challenges weren't temporary. They weren't minor. They weren't going away. The report recommended specialized therapy, modified educational approaches, and most critically, removal from high-stress public environments. Instead of following medical advice, the palace had chosen a different path. They'd hired media consultants. They'd scheduled carefully controlled photo opportunities. They'd created an elaborate performance designed to convince the public that everything was normal. The file contained communications between senior royal staff that read like evidence in a criminal trial. The prince's condition presents a significant PR challenge. Public perception of the heir's fitness for future roles must be protected. Recommend limited exposure protocols until viable management strategies are established. Management strategies. As if Louis was a problem to be solved rather than a child who needed help. The most damning document came from the palace's chief medical officer, Dr. Harrison Matthews, in a memo dated February 15, 2026. The parents, particularly the Princess of Wales, are resistant to long-term management protocols. Recommend administrative intervention if cooperation cannot be secured through conventional channels. Administrative intervention. Palace code for forcing compliance through official channels, regardless of parental wishes. But Catherine had discovered the file 3 weeks ago. She'd photographed every page. She'd documented every recommendation her son's doctors had made that the palace had ignored. She'd built a case that would destroy the monarchy's credibility if it ever became public. The palace didn't know she had the evidence. They were about to find out. Hidden beneath the medical assessments and administrative memos was a single handwritten note, signed by Catherine herself and dated March 5th, just 2 days before her explosive broadcast. It contained only 7 words, but those words would echo through constitutional history. I choose my son over your crown. The king's response came at dawn on March 8th, delivered through channels so secretive that most of his own staff learned about it from news reports. Constitutional Emergency Protocol 7 had been activated. Catherine's access to royal communication systems was terminated. Her security detail was reassigned. Her official engagements were cancelled indefinitely. The message was unmistakable. Step back in line or face complete institutional isolation. But the crown had miscalculated. Catherine wasn't fighting for her title or her position. She was fighting for her son. The palace's threats meant nothing to someone who had already chosen exile over silence. By noon, rumors were circulating through royal correspondent networks. The king had convened an emergency session with constitutional lawyers. Topics discussed included the removal of royal titles, the revocation of palace access, and the legal mechanisms available to prevent further unauthorized communications with the media. The nuclear option was being prepared. Catherine would be stripped of her royal status entirely, reduced from Princess of Wales to a private citizen with no platform, no protection, and no voice. Legal documents were being drafted in the deepest secrecy. Precedent was being researched. Historical cases of royal defiance were being analyzed for applicable solutions. The machinery of constitutional monarchy was grinding toward a solution that would erase Catherine from the official record entirely. Phone calls were made to editors of major newspapers. Quiet meetings were arranged with television executives. Social media platforms received requests to limit the spread of unverified royal content. The establishment was closing ranks with military precision. But as the king's advisors worked through the night preparing their counterattack, they missed one critical detail. Catherine wasn't alone anymore. Public opinion had shifted so dramatically in the 12 hours since her broadcast that any move against her would be seen as an attack on a mother protecting her child. The latest polling data, delivered to Buckingham Palace at 11:47 p.m., contained numbers that made senior advisors physically pale. Catherine's approval rating, 89%. The king's approval rating, 31%. The monarchy's approval rating, 24%. The crown was about to declare war on the most popular member of the royal family in modern history. Catherine's phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. with a message that made her blood freeze. Your communication privileges have been revoked by order of His Majesty. Surrender all devices immediately. She stared at the screen, then deleted the message. The palace thought they could silence her by cutting off her official channels. They were wrong. 47 minutes later, Catherine sat in the cottage kitchen, speaking into a borrowed phone while Louis slept peacefully upstairs. The call lasted exactly 37 minutes. On the other end was Keisha Williams, a constitutional lawyer who specialized in cases the establishment preferred to ignore. They can strip my title, Catherine whispered into the phone. They can take away my security. They can erase me from every official photograph. But they cannot take away my voice as Louis's mother. The conversation that followed would reshape British constitutional law. Keisha explained the legal reality. Catherine's rights as a mother superseded any royal protocol. The palace could punish her, but they couldn't silence her when it came to her child's welfare. By sunrise, Catherine had made her choice. She wasn't fighting for her position as Princess of Wales. She was fighting as Louis's mother. The crown couldn't touch that relationship, no matter how many ancient clauses they invoked. She walked to the cottage window, watching Louis play in the garden with a freedom he'd never experienced at the palace. No cameras. No protocol officers. No performance requirements. Just a child being a child. Catherine picked up her phone and typed a single text message to the palace press secretary. I am done explaining. The gray manila folder arrived at Catherine's cottage at exactly 2:15 p.m., delivered by a woman who introduced herself only as someone who believes children come first. Inside were documents that would end careers and topple reputations. Catherine spread the papers across the kitchen table. Medical reports the palace had buried. Communication records between senior staff discussing Louis's management. Financial documents showing payments to media consultants hired to craft a false narrative about her son's condition. But the most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amara Jackson, Louis's actual pediatrician, had been documenting everything. Every appointment the palace had canceled. Every treatment recommendation they'd ignored. Every time they'd prioritized royal appearances over medical needs. The documentation was methodical, clinical, unbreakable. Dates, times, witnesses. A paper trail that proved the palace had actively worked against Louis's medical team. They hadn't just hidden his condition. They'd made it worse by refusing proper treatment. Catherine photographed every document with surgical precision. She uploaded each file to a secure server provided by Keisha Williams. The evidence was now beyond the palace's reach, protected by attorney-client privilege and backed up in multiple locations. A handwritten note fell from the folder's back pocket. Dr. Jackson's careful script read, "Louis deserves better than this performance. You have everything you need to give it to him." Catherine folded the note and placed it in her pocket. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. Tomorrow the world would see what the crown had been hiding. She looked upstairs toward Louis's room, where he was napping peacefully for the first time in months. The choice was clear. At 4 p.m. on March 9th, Catherine stepped in front of cameras for the second time in 3 days. This broadcast wasn't from a cottage garden. This was from Dr. Jackson's medical office with Louis's actual medical team standing behind her. 2 days ago, I told you the palace was lying about my son's condition. Catherine began, her voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. Today, I'm going to prove it. She held up the first document. Louis's original diagnosis, dated 8 months earlier, with treatment recommendations that could have changed everything. The palace had received this report and buried it. "Louis has autism spectrum disorder," Catherine announced, her words cutting through decades of royal secrecy. He needed specialized therapy, modified learning environments, and reduced public exposure. Instead, the palace gave him performance coaching and media training. The camera zoomed in on medical records showing missed appointments, canceled treatments, and ignored recommendations. Each document bore the official seal of the royal medical household, making them impossible to deny. Dr. Jackson stepped forward, her voice steady and professional. Prince Louis was failed by the institution that claimed to protect him. Medical decisions were overruled by public relations concerns. Treatment was delayed to maintain appearances. Catherine's hands shook as she held up the final document. A memo from the king's private secretary, dated 1 week ago, outlining plans to send Louis to a discreet residential facility, where his condition could be managed away from public view. "They wanted to hide my son," Catherine said, her voice breaking with controlled fury. "They wanted to warehouse him because his truth was inconvenient for their image." The camera captured the moment her composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never wavered. "I moved him here because this is where he can heal. This is where he can be a child instead of a problem to be solved." The broadcast ended with Catherine looking directly into the camera. "I am no longer Princess of Wales. I am Louis's mother. That is the only crown I need." King Charles's abdication announcement came at 7:22 a.m. on March 10th, delivered through a brief written statement that shook the Commonwealth to its foundation. Effective immediately, I am stepping back from all constitutional duties to allow for necessary institutional reforms. The palace gates were locked. Senior staff were resigning by the hour. Constitutional lawyers were working around the clock to manage a succession crisis nobody had prepared for. The monarchy that had survived for 1,000 years was collapsing under the weight of one mother's truth. Catherine's revelation had triggered an avalanche of support that buried every attempt at damage control. Protests formed outside Buckingham Palace demanding answers. Parents of children with disabilities shared their own stories of institutional discrimination. Medical professionals called for investigations into royal healthcare policies. The polls told the story in devastating detail. 78% of the British public supported Catherine's decision to protect Louis. Only 12% believed the palace had acted appropriately. The monarchy's approval rating had crashed to single digits. Parliament convened emergency sessions. The Prime Minister faced calls for a formal inquiry into royal medical practices. International media were calling it the Great Royal Reckoning, the moment the institution's moral authority evaporated entirely. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Prince William issued his own statement at noon, standing beside his wife Kate outside their private residence. "My brother supports our sister-in-law completely. Louis deserves love, not management. Catherine chose courage over compliance, and history will remember her for it." The old guard had lost. The institution they'd spent decades protecting was crumbling. Catherine had won by refusing to play their game. Anonymous palace sources were already leaking that emergency protocols were being developed to prevent future Catherine situations. Files marked Category Red were reportedly being destroyed to prevent similar exposures. The cottage window glowed warm and golden in the evening light of March 15th, 1 week after Catherine had broken her silence. Inside, Louis sat at the kitchen table, working on a puzzle with the focused concentration that his palace handlers had once tried to suppress. No cameras captured this moment. No protocol officers managed his behavior. No media consultants crafted narratives about his progress. This was simply a child being allowed to exist as himself, supported by medical professionals who saw his potential instead of his challenges. Catherine watched from the doorway, no longer carrying the weight of royal expectations. The title was gone. The privileges were revoked. The institution had expelled her completely. She had never been happier. Outside, the world was adjusting to a new reality. The monarchy would survive, but it would never again have absolute control over truth. Other royal families worldwide were quietly reviewing their own medical privacy policies. Parents everywhere were asking harder questions about institutions that claimed to know better than they did. Dr. Jackson's final report, released to international medical journals, had sparked conversations about childhood development, autism acceptance, and the damage caused by forcing children into inappropriate roles. Louis had become an unwitting catalyst for change that stretched far beyond royal palaces. The cottage had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of love choosing truth over convenience, of parents choosing their children over institutions, of courage winning against systems designed to crush individual voices. Catherine tucked Louis into bed, reading him the same story she'd read to him in the palace, but now without rushing through it for the cameras. His laughter filled the small room, genuine and unperformed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal battles over custody rights, financial independence without royal support, building a life beyond the institution that had defined her identity for years. But tonight, watching her son sleep peacefully in a place where his truth was celebrated instead of hidden, Catherine knew she had made the only choice that mattered. The question that would define the monarchy's future remained unanswered. If an institution cannot protect its most vulnerable members, does it deserve to exist at all? What do you think? Can the royal family rebuild trust after this revelation, or has Catherine's courage changed everything forever? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective could inspire other parents facing impossible choices. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories about courage, truth, and the power of choosing love over loyalty. Hit that subscribe button and let us know what inspires you to speak up when it matters most.